Hello chess friends and welcome to the Art of Chess channel and welcome back to the TCEC Cup 10 finals in 2022. So we're following now the brutal and epic match game between the two top engines, Stockfish 15 and the Komodo Dragon engine, and this is now a big opportunity for the developers of the Stockfish engine to win every tournament that's possible in the computer chess world, because recently Stockfish won the computer Blitz Rapid Chess Championship, won also the TCEC competition in classical time format chess, and has now the opportunity, of course, with the Cup 10 finals to reach everything, to win every single tournament. So let's see now what happened. I've sorted out now beautiful caro-kann game from the super finals. In my opinion, many beginners are trying to play the caro-kann because the caro-kann makes sense in the beginning. You can play really 10-15 moves without calculating so much. You get a solid position. I'm not a big fan of the caro-kann because of the structural weaknesses in the continuation of the game, but as I said, in the near future I think we'll do sort of a tutorial to playlist about the caro-kann defense from Black's perspective, because maybe I'll get back to it, and will also of course share my ideas in the caro-kann with you in some instructive videos. So let's see now a beautiful caro-kann game, and then at the end of the video I'm going to review the result of the super match. So here e4 was played by Stockfish. We have c6 by the Komodo Dragon engine. We have d4, d5, knight to c3. We have d takes e4, knight to e4. We have reached now the main line, and after move knight to f6, here the pre-arranged line was knight takes f6. Now you have two choices. You can take with the pawn on with the g pawn. You can also take with the e pawn. The correct way here, and that's the problem now for the Komodo Dragon engine continuation, is to take with the e pawn, because it seems a little bit risky that you're opening the e file, but checks here by white don't make sense. We'll cover simply. The good part about this structure here is that you're controlling still this very important two centralized squares, but the g file is closed, so still you can castle kingside. That's now the beautiful thing about this structure. After move g takes f6, it's risky here, I think, to castle kingside, especially because of some possibilities to attack here on the g file. Queenside castling would be also here risky for Black, because white can attack the position immediately, and already with the move c6 you have already weakened the pawn structure there. So there's now the c7 weakness, d6 weakness, b6 weakness, so castling queenside is also risky. So that's why this g takes f6 is a worst continuation. That was actually the pre-arranged line. Stockfish made a draw in this particular position, so as I said, we see now how the Dragon engine handled this types of structure. So here we have knight to f3, we have the bishop to g4, pinning the knight, bishop to e2, we have a knight to d7, and now kingside castling by Stockfish. So these moves are really normal. So we have e6 getting further control here, and also developing the dark bishop, bishop to d6, bishop to e7 if necessary. In some occasions maybe bishop to b4 is an opportunity, but the bishop has to come out. So here Stockfish plays c4, getting some spaces in the center, controlling of course now this four squares on this side of the board. So we have bishop to g7, and now a beautiful move which makes really sense if you understand the pawn structure that I said in the beginning. It's the move a4, because for instance, if Black continues now with this idea, queen to e7, we play queen to b3, attacking maybe here the pawn on b7. You see now, if queenside castle happens, that could be maybe Black's idea, because we said, okay, the g file is open. Maybe in the near future Black would love, of course, maybe to get the rook on the g file and attack somehow, maybe with bishop to h3, maybe maneuver somewhere the bishop. I'm not sure, but maybe this could be an attacking formation sort of for Black to at least get something. But you see, with the move a4, that's what I liked about this move a4. White will continue simply the attack on the queen side immediately, so white will be much faster on the attack than Black. Black still needs to maneuver the bishop somewhere, getting the rook on the g file, improve maybe somehow the position, getting more pieces in the attack. So Black will need 4, 5, 6 tempi in order to make something out of it. Meanwhile white is already here. White needs only one more move in order to mess up the pawn structure of Black's here on the queen side. So that's why I really love the move a4. It really makes sense because it's not allowing Black to castle queen side. So Black has now really some worries where I'm going to castle. So in the continuation, kingside castling was played, which is, as I said, in my opinion, not so good because of some structural weaknesses. There is this h6 weakness. Bishop on g7 is only only used as a defensive piece. If you improve it with f5, then again f6 is weak, so I really don't like already black's position. So we have a5. Stockfish continues the attack on the queen side, is saying I will even push a6, then create really some madness on the queen side. So here we have rook to e8, a6, b6, we have h3, and after bishop to h5, this is now also a beautiful maneuver that I like. d5 is actually a beautiful possibility. Look how Stockfish with the move h3 decoyed the bishop here where it's connected to the d5 square. You see now why? Because after move d5, you see c takes d5, c takes d5. Now after e takes d5 and queen to d5, look, the bishop is here and we can attack it with the queen. No worries about the rook to e2 move, because if rook to e2 happens, then of course we take, and now there are many position problems. Knight to h4 is going to happen here, knight to f5. I'm not seeing even good way how you should make progress here. Bishop to f4 will happen, rook to d1, rook to c1. So again, white would build, I think, a beautiful attacking formation. So this is, in my opinion, not working for black. Let's go back a little bit. After move c takes d5 here, what you could do maybe is this idea, e5. So you don't have to create this messed up pawn structure here. You can pass through, but actually this is also a suicide for black, because strategically black is losing the game. I think we can play knight to h4. If you play bishop to e2, then we play queen to e2, and you see now again you have some weaknesses here around the square f5. You could maybe try here bishop to g6 to maybe retreat here, but then you get bishop to g4 and still you cannot protect anymore the weak f5 square. You can play maybe knight to c5, knight to f5, and again look at this, h6 weak, the queen will come into the game here, bishop to h6 an opportunity. Every single piece is coordinated towards the king side, and again black could face many tactical problems. So you see c takes d5, so e5 is not working because of the weakness of f5. So that's why e takes d5. We have queen to d5, as we also have seen. Rook to e2 doesn't make sense. So that's why the Dragon engine tried knight to e5, tried of course this idea. If you take, of course, knight to pardon me, sorry, that's not the point. So let's go back here. What you don't want to get is, of course, you don't want to play knight to e5, because then it would be simply improve the pawn structure. So that's why Stockfish played a brilliant move here, and that's the only move that is helping out white here. With this move, we're staying with every piece on the board, even if black tries maybe knight to f3, bishop to f3, bishop to f3, queen to f3. But this is again a much better continuation for white. Look at this, f5 is weak again. Even if you try maybe with the move f5, we can play rook to a4. We don't have to even move the bishop here. The bishop is perfectly fine on c1, but now we can include this rook into the game. f5 is weak. We can even try in the near future, if the queen moves somewhere, maybe even rook to h4. So I would not love really to play now anymore this game from black's perspective, because of the weaknesses in front of the king. So it's maybe a simplified line, but it doesn't make sense here for black. So after move queen to b3, queen to e7 was played by the Komodo Dragon engine. We have bishop to f4, we have knight to rook to d8, we have rook to d1, competing now on the d file, and now knight to g6, attacking the bishop. Here Stockfish plays again a beautiful move, bishop to e3, cutting off here the connection on the e file, protects also the bishop on e2. So f5, this is now a serious threat. The serious threat is of course the move f4. Now Stockfish plays a beautiful move, rook to e1. This move is brilliant, because if you play now f4, this is not good, because you get this tactical shot, bishop takes b6. I'm not sure how many of us would even consider this move, but this was a beautiful tactical preparation by Stockfish. This wasn't played of course in the game, but I wanted to show you what will happen. Why is this f4 move really bad? Because bishop to b6, look at this, a takes b6. Now we play bishop to b5. The knight is protecting this rook on the e file, so no rook to queen takes e1 possibilities are going to happen here. So that's why black needs to play knight to e5 in order again to cut off the connection on the e file. But now after knight to e5, bishop to e5, we can take out here the rook on e8. Look at this, rook to e8, and now with queen to d5, this is simply game over for black, because the bishop is hanging, the pieces on the e file are paralyzed. And now with the move queen to d5, notice that we are only 2 moves far away from promotion here on a8. So we will play then a7. If the queen takes, of course, then we simply take out the bishop and we're up the exchange. Which a7, a8, we have a promotion. One of these pieces will be deflected to the queen side for sure, and we can simply grab the piece. So really brilliant tactical shot it would have been if, of course, the Komodo Dragon dragon engine would have played f4. So after move rook to e1 f4, we have seen it's not a possibility. We have queen to f8, we have queen to b5, attacking now this weakness that's present through the whole game. Simple targeted pawn on f5. Knight to e5, we have knight to d4, we have bishop to e2, knight to e2 prevents also again this very annoying move f4. We have queen to d6, bishop to g5, attacking the rook, rook to c8, and now knight to g3. So Stockfish is having of course a clear plan. Black doesn't have a clear plan here. That's, I think, the huge difference. The clear plan is of course the structural weakness on f5, and black doesn't have to cannot really make anything out of this, so black is basically defending through the whole game. So we have queen to e6, bishop to e3, a rook to d8, bishop to f4, attacking the knight, a rook to d5, attacking the queen, queen to b3. We have now the rook to d4, attacking the bishop on f4, and now after queen to e6, a rook to e6 has to be played, because if you try of course f takes e6, then you have lost the connection between the rook and the knight, and black loses simply the piece on e5. So that's why you have to play a rook to e6, and you see now again black didn't solve this pawn on f5. Black still has this annoying pawn on f5 as a weakness. So here we have bishop to e3, first retreating with the bishop, of course. We have rook to d5, and now rook to d1, trying of course to simplify the game by trading off some pieces. So we have here knight to d3, really wild move, of course, attacking the b2 weakness, but Stockfish again finds a beautiful way to get out of this mess with the move knight to f5, because if you try bishop to b2, then we can play here knight for bishop to b2, we can play immediately g4, supporting the knight here, which is perfectly fine. And now the knight is a little bit loose on the board. You have to play something like h5 to undermine a little bit the protection on g4. Now we can play rook to d2, trying of course a battery on the d file. Bishop to c3 is sort of a must move, and now after rook to c2 you have to again retreat with the bishop. Now we can play even f4, again the bishop has to move somewhere, and now with this annoying check the king has to move, and now we can take knight takes g7, king to g7, and now after bishop to d2, look at this again, we have a great carrot here, support with this pawn. f5 f6 could happen, and this is quite an unpleasant game here for black. So as I said, after move knight to f5, things are really unclear here, so you cannot really take immediately the pawn on b2. That's why in the continuation h5 was played, but now Stockfish takes the bishop on g7 anyway. We have king to g7, and now after move rook to d2, finally this pawn is protected. So it's now bishop versus knight endgame. Of course white is also up a pawn, so this should be probably winning for Stockfish. So we have here king to g6, we have a rook to d1 attacking down the knight, we have a rook to d6, and now king to f1, getting the king closer, and of course trying to grab the knight on d3. Knight to b4, we have king to e2, rook takes d2, bishop to d2 attacks the knight. We have knight takes a6, but it doesn't matter because still Stockfish lost the pawn, but it's only temporarily because now the pawn on a7 is hanging. Here Dragon tried some kind of a tactic, but now after king to f1 we have again this idea, bishop to f4, bishop to rook to f6, and now with bishop to e3 everything is glued together, everything is compact. Now the knight has to move, and Stockfish gets again the pawn back. So it's still unclear, of course. This is still a hard endgame to play. Maybe even in top grandmaster level, I'm not sure if white would win so many times this potential endgame, but as I said, in top engine level, especially when Stockfish is playing the game, this should be probably a winning endgames here. So after move rook to c6 was played by Dragon, bishop to d2, we have rook to c2, we have king to e1, protecting also the bishop. You cannot take so far the pawn because you lose of course the knight on c7. So knight to e8, rook to a2, knight to c7 again, and here Stockfish plays simply king to d1, getting the king closer, and now the rook has to really step back. So we have a rook to c5, a rook to a7. Again, Stockfish is not allowing this rook to breathe, so it's not allowing this rook to play freely. We have knight to d5, a rook to a4, trying also to cut off here the potential king's ability to play, because if the king for instance gets here very active, then this should be again a good position for black. So king to f6, we have rook to h4, attacks also now the weak pawn on h5. We have here knight to c7, and actually this pawn on h5 will be now again the main target of whites. This is now the only way to win this potential endgame for white. So white has to take out somehow this pawn, will then create eventually 3 versus 1 pawn majority on the king side, even if white loses maybe the pawn on b2. I've explained it many times. What you want to get here out of this endgame are 2 connected pass pawns. If you manage to do that, then you will probably have a winning endgame. If you don't do that, if maybe these 2 pawns are off the board, maybe if you trade off this pawn for this pawn somehow, then it's unclear. Although it's a 3 versus 2 situation, but still with a knight on the board, that could be very annoying. Probably this will be in a drawish position. So as I said, the only way is somehow to grab this pawn on h5 and create a pawn majority, a 3 versus 1 situation on the king side. So here bishop to e3 attacks the rook. We have a rook to b5, king to c2. We have king to e6, rook to e4, a check. Rook to f4, attacking also again the pawn. Again the king goes to e6. Again we have some perpetuals, and now g3 by Stockfish. Knight to e6, we have rook to c4. Of course, what this move is preventing is of course this idea, knight to c5. We will then eventually take, because then black should not trade off the rooks, because if you trade off the rooks, then it's a completely winning endgame, because no pieces are on the board, and this is something that black should try to avoid. So after move rook to c4, we have knight to c7, rook to f4, again king to e7, protecting the pawn. We have now rook to e4. You see, Stockfish has to play also some tiny little moves. So in the beginning, I'm not sure if Stockfish knows how to even win this endgame. So now Stockfish, after move knight to d5, retreats with the bishop on d2. We have here knight to e7, and now rook to f4. This is again an idea maybe to cut off somehow the king's ability to play, maybe get the rook somehow even behind the pawn. Of course, also the f7 is a weakness, so we have here king to e6. But now again you see Stockfish is playing tiny little moves. Right now again this idea, rook to b4. Again, if black takes, then it's a bishop versus knight endgame without the rooks, of course, and this should be probably again winning for white, because of the fact that again there are pawns on both sides. So maybe in the near future this pawn could be a problem, and then maybe white can also create a pass pawn here, pass pawn maybe on the king side, so that it would be for sure an unpleasant game for black. So after move rook to b4, we have a rook to c5, king to d3, knight to d5, rook to d4, pinning the knight to the king. We have king to e6, rook to e4, king to d7, and now rook to e5. This is finally the move that I think Stockfish wanted to get, getting the rook on the 5th rank where already the pawn is, and now it's mission accomplished. Now Stockfish has a clearer idea how to of course grab the pawn. So we have here f6. So what you should not do here in this position is of course rook to f5, then king to e6 is going to happen. Even if you take the pawn here, the knight to f4 is very dangerous. You have to take it, then you lose the rook. The engine gives here equal chances even for both sides, but of course from white's perspective you want to win the game. So that's why after move rook to e4 was played, we have b5. Even if you try here some other possibilities, even if you try maybe to get again the king to d4, it's unclear, because b4 is going to happen, and again the rook would be a little bit out of game. You have to play rook to c7, and I think in the near future with rook to h4, again Stockfish has the possibility to attack this pawn. You cannot even defend it like this, because you get b5, and this should be game over. So as I said, b5 was played by the dragging engine, but now bishop to e3, we have knight to e3, king to e3, and after rook to c2, now Stockfish plays rook to d4, and will try again to get this rook on the 5th rank. So we have king to e6, rook to b4, protects the b2 pawn and also attacks the b5 pawn. So that's why rook to b4, we have rook to h4, king to d6, and now b4. This is really a beautiful move. So we have here rook to c3, and now again a very important move, king to e4, because even if rook to c4 happens, still we can play king to f5. The cool part about this sequence is that the king is now getting closer and closer to the pawns. Even if you trade, of course, you create maybe double pawns, but this pawn is weak. You can maybe get the king here, we push the king here to g6, we'll eventually take out this pawn, and this is game over. So that's why after king to e4, Dragon played king to e6, we have rook to h5 finally. Now comes the check, and after king to f3, we have rook to b4, and as I said, this is the position that we wanted to get. 3 versus 1 pawn majority, even if we lose the pawn here. So black has a passer, it doesn't matter, but it's only an isolated passer. Now white can always create 2 connected pass pawns here. Of course, still this pawn on g3 is not a pass pawn, but in the near future it can become, maybe when we trade out the f pawn for this f pawn on f6. So as I said, this is now really beautiful endgame strategy by the Stockfish engine. So we have here g4, we have rook to b2, h4, simply pushing the pawn further. We have rook to f5, king to e6, and now h5. So Stockfish makes first also progress with this pass pawn on the h file. So we have b4, h6, rook to a3, h7, and now the key rook has to come here. Beautiful endgame technique. And now rook to b5, because here's the dragon engine played b3. Even if you try here rook to h8, then comes a beautiful move, a rook to b7, and everything is glued together. Now you can play maybe with the king to d5. We're playing much more active with the king. This is not that they played in the continuation of the game, but I really wanted to show you also this possibility. After king to g3, we have king to c6. Now rook to f7 would happen. You could maybe try here b3. Now we take, but it comes with the check. That's the beauty how Stockfish calculates this endgame. Now you can maybe try a king to c5. Now we play again rook to f7. Now even if you try rook to b8, now a rook to b7 is winning the game, because if you take, of course, then we promote, then it should be game over. So this is something that you should try to avoid. If you, of course, again play on this side, we will take the pawn, and then of course it's again completely winning for white. So after move rook to b5, the dragon engine, as I said, played b3, rook takes b3, but now after king to f7, rook to b7, king to e6, king to g3, there's not a good way anymore to protect everything. As I said, Stockfish will create two connected pass pawns. So rook to b6, we have king to f7, g5. This is now again a beautiful move. F takes g5, and now rook to h6 creates now this new possibility. We have rook to a8. Even if you try, of course, here to bring the rook being behind, then with king to g4, or maybe like this, but still we can take. And even if it takes, then we play with the king here. We'll play with the king on e7, f4, f5. We have a clear path for our pass pawn on the f file. It's game over. So after move rook to h6, we have rook to a1. We have a promotion, and now after a couple more moves in this position, the Komodo dragon resigns. So great endgame technique, I think, by Stockfish 15. Stockfish, of course, eventually won the TCEC Cup 10 finals. Congratulations again to developers of this beautiful chess engine. What do you say? This is really a chess from another dimension. I'm not sure how many of us would consider even many of these moves that Stockfish showed us here in the game. First, this beautiful strategy to create weaknesses, then eventually winning a pawn, then going into a rook and pawn endgame, creating a distant pass pawn, creating the possibility of connected pass pawns, then a beautiful maneuver with the rook, and then eventually winning the game. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. Interesting ideas of the caro-kann defense. If you want to see more beautiful attacking games like this, check out my commented chess games played by computer series with some more games played by Stockfish, Alpha Zero, Little C Zero, Dragon Engine, and many more. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.